Laura and Pete sat in the departure lounge of Flight 3425 to Bali, holding hands after all of their preparations. It was good to finally complete all of the formalities. Laura closed her eyes. She needed the getaway. It had been a long year. Yes, 2 weeks of sunshine. Exactly what the doctor ordered. Pete let go of her hand to get his phone from his pocket when he heard the message alert. "Laura, remember to put your phone in airplane mode. I did not bring my phone with me." Pete was distracted by the phone screen. Laura was studying his face when she noticed it tighten up. "What is the problem, Pete?" Pete anxiously handed her the phone and she read Peter over. "Raise your hand to this woman and you will regret it for the rest of your life. God, Pete, you're a fool. You must have warned your wife." "She knows." Laura joined Pete, taking in all of the visible faces in the main room. "Impossible, Laura. I packed everything last night while she was sleeping and loaded the suitcases directly into the car. She was kinder to me than ever before. It cannot be her." Then, "Pete, that must be the incorrect number." "No, it mentions my name, you see." "Could this be your husband?" "Do not be silly. He doesn't have a clue either. He believes I'm away on a 2-week course. Besides, how would he know your name and number? We've been quite cautious." "Absolutely. Nobody knows about us." "Whose number is it?" "I do not recognize anyone. I have some crazy pals and I doubt they'd want to perpetrate a prank on me." "Tell me what. I'll call Penny and you can contact your husband. See if they notice anything unusual." Laura observed Pete press the speed dial number. There was no answer, so he left a message that he already missed her. Pete hung up and glanced at Laura, puzzled. "Are you planning to call your husband?" "I did not bring my phone with me. You can use mine." Laura began to grab for the offered phone, and they both realized how ridiculous that was. For the first time, Laura began to regret her decision. A call about boarding the plane halted the chat. They stood in line together, but they no longer felt safe holding hands in public. Laura spotted Pete examining the passengers for familiar faces. Laura was slightly amused by this. He continued his search as they moved to their seats. They took their seats, and Laura linked her arm over his and lay her head on his shoulder. "Why didn't you carry your cell phone, Laura? It's all part of my devious strategy. You will be proud of me for it. I will show you once we are in the air." Laura took her laptop from her suitcase about half an hour later as the plane reached altitude. She started it up and went to a Word document. "I made an investment in our future lover. When my husband gets into bed tonight, he will find a note from me. If he disagrees with the statement, we have lost nothing, and if he does, this vacation will just be the start of a new life for both of us. Here is a copy." She handed Pete the computer. "My beloved hubby, I have loved you and only you for 25 years. I hope to spend the next 25 or more years with you. This is what I've always desired and continue to dream for. Every day I fall more in love with you, and I am delighted to have dedicated my life to caring for you and our precious children. With the exception of a few visits to pals, I've asked for very little for myself. I know you love me and always want me to be happy and fulfilled. Because we love each other, I'd like to propose to you. I purposefully handled this such that you would have 2 weeks to consider my idea. If we did it face to face, there is a high risk of you being macho towards me and saying something we won't be able to get beyond. I cannot take that risk. This is the same reason I left my phone there, so you cannot contact me for the next 2 weeks. I am not on a workhorse, and no one knows where I am, so don't waste time attempting to reach me. Darling, you are an amazing lover, and I never tire of being in your arms. However, I miss having sex with other people so much that I risk infuriating you by doing what I do. Before you become enraged, keep things in context. I'll be away for 2 weeks with a coworker friend. I've never been unfaithful to you, and I won't be without your full consent. My proposal is as follows. With your permission, I'd like to do it with other men. I believe that my requirements have grown so large that one man, even one as gifted as you, cannot meet them. It will never be somebody you know. And I pledge to always remain discreet. In fact, I will be so subtle that you will have no idea when or where I will be unless you tell me. If anyone we know suspects what I'm doing, I'll cease right away. You'll always have me there whenever you need me. Nothing about it will change. You're my husband, and your needs will always come first. I want you to know that this will not impact my feelings about you or our lovemaking together. In summary, we will not be affected in any manner. Think about it over the next 2 weeks. Please, darling, if you love me as much as you say, you will use this moment to demonstrate it. I understand how much you adore me, and that awareness will accompany me every time I fall asleep at night while I am away. That is why I trust you to pamper me right now. Please, dear, think about it over the next 2 weeks. If your answer is no, I will respect your wishes and would welcome the opportunity to speak further. I'll try not to be upset by the names you call me and the apparent lack of confidence. If the response is yes, all you need to say is, the answer is yes, and we don't need to talk about it anymore. I would be pleased to do so if you wanted. Laura, your loving wife. Pete finished reading and simply murmured, "Wow." Yes, it is good, isn't it? I must admit that I copied many of the phrases from a novel I saw on an erotic fiction website by a 33-year-old man named Biggie, who stated, "We need to talk. Why did you describe writing as an investment in our future? Don't you get it? I asked for my husband's permission. If he agrees, we will be able to resume our normal lives without feeling guilty." Laura mentally added, "Well, I can spend 2 weeks with you and be sure I don't need you anymore. But your replacement? That's another thing. Are you sure he'll agree to that?" Of course, I have given the impression that he has a choice, but only so he can convince himself that he has control. If he says no, we'll have to continue sneaking around like we used to. So how do you like it? Not bad, decisive and rational. However, he will never base his decision on logic. I hope he is not a real man, otherwise it's slightly disrespectful. What? Nothing in the letter could possibly anger him. It took me days to write it. Exactly. Yes, but you must remember that you may spend a whole year insulting him. As a woman, you will never grasp how a man's brain functions. The primary takeaway from the letter is that he is no longer capable of satisfying you, and no matter how good he is, he never will. Laura, you should realize that every man is slightly paranoid about his work. The prospect of leaving you for someone who may be bigger or better drives your worry. Honestly, Laura, I can only imagine 2 reactions to him reading this. One option is to give up and give in. The other option is to come out swinging. So I think you're wrong. I know my hubby. He will appreciate my candor and give it serious consideration. If I inquire before doing something, there will be no risk. Pete gazed at his potential lover, wondering how much she believed her own gibberish. He was already seeing her in a different light. Sure, he was stretching the truth to obtain this pass from his wife. However, Laura's outright lying and exploitation of her husband disturbed him. Part real interest, part devilishness, drove him to his next question. How did Laura's huge guy story pan out? Did the lady make the most of her drink? He had his response long before she opened her mouth. Her expression abruptly got serious. No, her husband had kicked her out, to distract her from questioning whether she was doing the right thing. Peter shifted the topic of conversation. After all of the work and expense of this trip, the last thing he wanted was for her conscience to awaken and do what the letter instructed. An innocent vacation. I didn't tell you about the lunatic I saw at international registration, did I? He was only 25 meters away from me as I was in line. When he caught me looking at him, he simply gazed at me and slashed his index finger across my throat. I looked around to see whether he was doing it to anyone behind me, but there was nobody. It was creepy, Laura asked. Yeah, how did he look? The world is filled of eccentric, damaged individuals. That's the thing, Laura. He appeared to be a typical person. Over 6 feet, dark hair, and goatee. Peter paused as Laura sat up abruptly and scrambled for her laptop once again. She turned it on and browsed through various files. She pulled up a picture of herself and a man standing in front of the house, her voice shaking with concern. She asked, "Is that him?" It may be Laura, it certainly looks like him, but I'm not convinced. Laura regarded Peter with interest. Did he have a reason to lie to her? Was he scared that if Laura got sure her husband had figured out their games for the first time, she would realize Peter was a guy willing to cheat on his wife and hence essentially untrustworthy? Pete, what was that guy wearing? That is another woman's question, Laura. Guys do not notice what other guys are wearing. Didn't you mention he dropped you off at the domestic terminal? Yes, I did. I urged him to simply drop me off and go away. When I saw him leave, I boarded the bus for the international terminal. So he must have returned to his car, drove to the international airport, parked, and then determined who to pursue in the check-in queue. Quite unlikely. Laura, I think it was more likely a random psychopath. He knew he needed to distract Laura, who appeared unconvinced. "Is that your house in the photo, Laura?" Laura, who sought a distraction and was used to having people compliment her on her home, slipped into autopilot. "Yes, that is the one. Isn't it beautiful? We purchased the seaside house as an investment. It's really steep and narrow. You wouldn't suppose the house could collapse, would you? My spouse spent 15 years adding to it and gardening around it. You should see inside it. He is an artist, and each room has a mural with a theme, such as nautical in the baths and business in the living room/study. You enter inside the study, and the environment suggests work, so you work. I won't tell you what the theme is in the bedroom. We've won numerous accolades for the interior design and how the house uses the land. There is also a brook running underneath the house." The conversation turned to their families, a subject they had hitherto avoided in their relationship. They spoke about Pete's 2 children aged 6 and 8. Laura spoke about her 3. Sarah, a 23-year-old law school graduate working as a real estate lawyer, and her 2 children remained at home. Daniel, 16, and Larry, 13. Laura didn't realize it, but she desperately sought to divert herself. For a while, she was successful. She then took out a notepad and wrote lawyer, home, and children, not knowing if her husband was following her. She couldn't make plans for him. She understood she had to defend herself by safeguarding the house and family. Laura began to berate herself for being a coward and not thinking about her circumstance or the possibility of it. She pieced together the timeline of events she had packed on Thursday evening, making sure not to include anything non-business or inappropriate to wear on the weekend between the 2 weekly classes. That evening, her spouse acted totally normal. She arrived at work on Friday at her normal time. They wanted to conduct some substantial work on her corporate car, so she made arrangements for her husband to pick her up on Friday afternoon. He went into the reception area, waited for her to pack everything, then drove her home. They had lunch with the kids, drove them to their grandparents' place, and worked on it until late at night. Saturday morning, an early start, a journey to the airport. Laura remembers how nervous she was when she proposed that her husband simply take her bags to the check-in line and leave them. Other times, he remained until the plane took off. She was relieved when he quickly agreed. She'd observed him all the way to the parking lot and then waited for his car to leave. His impatience to go took on a deeper tone. She compared his actions last night and today to her meticulous planning. Hell, no one at her job knew anything except that she had taken yearly leave, and her spouse knew no one at her workplace. He had no idea what she was intending. The message that appeared on Pete's phone was a prank call from a friend. A man stared at him in the check-in area. A random nut. Relax, Laura. What would happen if he discovered out she had lied about her destination? So, what? According to the letter, she was traveling with a work friend. It did not clarify whether it was male or female. She wasn't aware she'd closed her eyes till they opened. She envisioned her spouse knowing her final destination at the airport and how it would appear to him. The deceit would have to appear as if she had sneaked away specifically to hide. That was serious. But with some technique, it could be defended. However, when combined with the letter's contents, it left no question. Laura should utilize the remainder of the flight to cover whatever she could. The first goal was to destroy the letter, which was lying under a pillow 2,500 centimeters away from her ass. The second task was to convince herself that she was overreacting to nothing. Laura, always ready to foresee every potential circumstance, wrote a lengthy letter to Sarah, knowing she couldn't send it before Bailey. In it, she requested her daughter to visit her house and perform 2 things. The first step was to seize custody of her phone and change it to Pete's number. She explained that she was ashamed to tell anyone she had forgotten it, so she had purchased a prepaid phone for the trip. The second mission was to grab the letter from beneath her father's pillow. She pleaded not to read it because it was so intimate, written between husband and wife. Mother and daughter were quite close, so she knew she could rely on her to not only follow the directions, but to be discreet about it. As an aside, Laura requested that Sarah acknowledge receipt of the letter and notify her that she had completed the task. Laura mailed the letter immediately after Pete and Laura stepped off the plane at Denpasar Airport, assuming her husband would not check the caller. ID called him using Pete's phone. None of her calls were returned at the time, nor during the hour it took to clear customs and check into their hotel. This has never occurred before. Just as the cab approached the hotel, warning bells rang in her thoughts. Sarah contacted Pete's phone and confirmed that she had done what was instructed. Laura managed to avoid a few questions about what was going on. Sarah inquired if her father was all right. Her response frightened her mother. Her father had called to say he had some things to think about and was bringing the other kids to his cabin in the country. Sarah was planning to join them that evening. Laura asked her husband what he planned to do this weekend. The solution, of course, did not include the cabin. Worse, the cabin was cut off from all 21st century sources of contact. Laura was so perplexed that she allowed her daughter make the call without more question. Chapter 2. Laura's husband has just prepared a BBQ dinner for his 3 children at the cottage. They begged him to take them camping to get wallabies for their favorite campfire stew tomorrow. Sarah notices her father has been distracted since his arrival, but she doesn't press him. They sit down for a family meeting. Sarah began the conversation. "Is it about Mom? Dad?" "Yeah." She's been acting strangely for several months now, somewhat emotionally detached, and yesterday. And this morning I learned some amusing things. The sensation of dread that pervaded the room was heightened by Dad's sigh as he ended his sentence. They recognized him as a strong but humorous man who was rarely serious. They waited. "Your mother informed me that she is taking a 2-week long-distance course for work." All 3 children acknowledged that she had told them as well. "Yesterday afternoon, she requested me to take her up from work. So I did." Standing in the waiting area, I could see her talking to a man in one of the offices through the glass. Something about how they stood or looked at one another didn't feel right. She didn't emerge for more than 5 minutes, so I went about the reception area. There is a wall with portraits of all of the company's high-ranking executives. I recognized the guy she was speaking with. His name is Peter Auer. I picked up his business card at the front desk this morning. I simply couldn't sleep, so I went downstairs. I'm a little embarrassed to confess that, but I glanced through your mother's purse. I found her passport inside, and when reading through it, I discovered a visa stamp for Indonesia dated 3 weeks ago. I noticed her reading a brochure about Bali last month. Their father hesitated and looked around the room, apparently thinking about what to say. Bali is an Indonesian island and not interstate. It's not in this country. I didn't say anything to your mother, but accusing someone of deception without proof, especially someone you care so deeply, is a bit much, Sarah interjected. We know, Dad. We were reared with your mother's principles, remember? Never cheat or deceive. Always treat everyone with respect until they lose it, then gently walk away. Yes, that's why what happened this morning is so difficult to comprehend, let alone discuss. The sad atmosphere in the room grew. They gave Dad as much time as he needed to collect his thoughts and decide what and how to say them. This morning, your mother wanted me to simply drop her off at the domestic airport and depart. She expressed concern about leaving you alone at home for an extended period of time. I agreed voluntarily and drove straight to the international terminal. I was waiting next to check in for tickets to Bali when I noticed Mr. Peter Auer checking in. I hid and continued to watch for 15 minutes until your mother arrived and checked in. I was too surprised to confront her. What do you think? Yes, Sarah, I believe your mother lied to me. To us. Really? And traveled to Bali to have an affair with someone she works with. The father turned away, but his 3 children could tell he was in a lot of pain. They had never seen the great man cry, and they were willing to pay practically anything to escape witnessing his apparent suffering. Now, one by one, beginning with Daniel, they wrapped their father in an embrace. Sarah resumed her leadership role. What are you planning to do, Dad? I honestly don't know, kids, but I know that if she ever sleeps with another man, our relationship is over. Fidelity is the foundation of marriage, and any breach is unacceptable. If she hasn't and isn't sleeping with him, I'm not sure how I'll survive her cheating. So far, all I've done is warn them both that if they touch each other, it will be trouble. That way I can put off making a decision until I have the opportunity to do so. Does this make sense? Sarah nodded at everyone before telling him what he didn't know. Mom left her phone at home. Dad, she wouldn't have received your message. I know how to contact her. Do you want me to tell her to leave the creep alone? No, Sarah. I want her to respond for her own reasons. A decision made out of dread of the consequences does not constitute a decision. She must have the correct motivation. What number did she provide you so you could call her? Sarah took out her phone and opened the lengthy letter from Laura. She recited the first 6 digits to her father, and he read the remaining 4 to her from a business card he produced from his pocket with a simple movement. All 4 people in the room were convinced that his story was absolutely true. A period of silence followed. "That is not all, Dad. Mom requested me to grab you a note from under your pillow at home." She reached into her bag, took out the offending letter, and held it out to him. Everyone was waiting for him to read it. He objected to reading it aloud because he already knew what it stated. Young Larry broke the deadlock. "Daddy, this is a letter about our family. We have always taken significant decisions as a family. You need to tell us." Dave stared at his youngest son and realized he'd never felt more proud. He was with his siblings in the midst of the most serious crisis his family had ever experienced, and he had managed it better than his own father. They had all handled it. They hugged again, and Dave began reading. He reread it 3 times, the second 2 accentuating the 3rd paragraph. Without the final paragraph, it was a perfectly acceptable request from a wife to her husband, and if accepted at its value, it was an entirely mature proposition. However, one statement in the 3rd paragraph ridiculed the entire message. "I'll be away for 2 weeks with a coworker friend. I've never been unfaithful to you, and I won't be without your full consent." One verified untruth makes the rest of the message questionable, or just incorrect. After an hour of adult debate, their mother and wife's motives turned out to be shockingly near to the reality after other solutions were dismissed. The obvious conclusion was reached, and a plan of action was established. Depending on the response to a single question, their mother probably no longer deserved to be a part of their family. Dave did his utmost to advocate for the absent party. "Children, please listen. If a crime was committed, it was against me, your mother's husband. You can't let it alter how you feel about her. Once again, it was little Larry who spoke for everyone. No, Papa, when she lied to all of us, she chose herself." Dave focused on his son, noting the protruding chin and serious gaze. He recognized that the acorn had not fallen far from the tree. Chapter 3. Laura startled Pete at the hotel reception desk by requesting a separate room on a different floor. She had reserved it for 2 days with the option of an extension and requested a right of first refusal if the room was entirely booked. Pete checked into the motel and questioned Laura. He was advised to think about it. Go into his room, unpack, and meet her in the lobby in 2 hours. He complied in an uncomfortable manner. They met at the scheduled time. Peter didn't think twice, and when he saw what Laura was wearing, he decided he didn't mind spooning her. They'd been together for a month, but aside from kissing and groping, nothing had happened. "What is happening on, Laura?" "Think about it, Peter. We decided to come here jointly. You receive a message on your phone addressed to you by name, stating that if you touch this woman, you will regret it for the rest of your life. This message arrived just after a man who resembled my spouse made a menacing gesture in your direction. Are you with me?" We arrived, and my daughter informed me that my husband had been acting strangely for the past 3 hours. My husband has not returned my calls, which is out of character for him. Pete was not an idiot. He understood what all of this may entail, but he didn't see or care about how it affected him. My husband is probably aware of the fact that we are here together. Do not ask me how. He understands that. I have no idea. I'm certain that if he finds out we slept together, my marriage will end. That's not a price I want to pay. If I was 100% certain, he knew I'd be on a flight home by now. And he does not know. How am I going to explain coming back so quickly without telling a complete lie? We've been together for 25 years. If he's alert, he'll spot a lie in a split second. I'm sorry, Peter, but we won't be sleeping together until I call my husband and convince myself he doesn't know anything. Peter appeared disappointed by the statement. Laura suspected he was going to dispute and interrupted him. Peter, if you were my spouse and suspected I was away with another man, what would you do? Easy. I'd employ a private investigator to gather proof. Laura watched logic burst through the desire filters in his thoughts. She was still upset that the gravity of her situation hadn't penetrated his thick skull. You haven't attempted calling your wife since you arrived here. That caught his attention. Peter quickly began peering around the dark corners of the hallway, attempting to locate the camera. Great, now you understand. Tonight and tomorrow, I shall be sleeping alone in my room. We'll work things out when my husband returns from scrubbing and has time to phone me. In the meantime, do not enter my room. Do not approach me unless it is in a public area. Please do not touch me. If my husband calls, do not answer or set the phone to voicemail. Find me as quickly as possible. These are the phone numbers he will be phoning from. Now give me a pleasant kiss on the cheek, and we will part ways." Peter obeyed the command, and they both went back to their quarters, keeping an eye out for monitoring. If either of them had bothered to look up the phone number mentioned in Pete's thread, they would have discovered that Laura was already 80% under surveillance. She just didn't realize it yet. Chapter 4. 4 days had passed, and the long-awaited excursion had not gone as planned. Meals were eaten in the hotel or restaurant, and no personal contact was made. Laura pulled Peter to multiple places for clothing despite his protests, and they even went on a day trip together on Tuesday. If they were followed, it was by experts. Laura insisted on spending all of their days together in case Dave called. Laura bought a discarded cell phone on Monday and had Pete practice switching to it in case he received a call. Her stress level just went up somewhat. The school holiday had arrived, and Dave could have brought Danielle and Larry to the cottage for more than one weekend. Sarah's failure to respond to emails, on the other hand, was cause for severe alarm. Peter held out till Tuesday evening. He retired early on Wednesday. Laura felt so concerned that she spent the entire day in her room browsing the internet for divorce information. She next emailed her in-home attorney, requesting confirmation of her expectations regarding the outcome of a hypothetical divorce. She utilized him to handle all of the family's personal legal issues. She oversaw all such affairs for the family. He stated that, while it was not his area of expertise, he thought her conclusions to be right. Dave and Sarah made 3 phone calls per day that went unanswered. The 80% level approached 90%. And she became emotionally isolated from everyone she knew. She felt more lonely than she had ever felt in her life. She pleaded with Sarah via email to reach her. Dave stopped using email after not receiving an answer until Friday. Laura resolved to protect her future. She contacted her attorney, who had all of the legal authorizations to freeze the family's finances. She transferred ownership of the sole remaining unoccupied plot of property to a trust, with Sarah and herself as trustees. Any of the signatories could gain access to the trust. She moved the majority of the family's assets into 2 separate trusts in the names of their underage children. Again, there were 2 trustees, but both signatures were required. The child in question, along with another. She obviously wanted the second one to be herself. However, the attorney persuaded her to make him the child's legal guardian. It would be more secure this way. He informed her that, of course, the child's signature was ineffective until he was 18, and that she had possession of her money in case the worst happened. And if everything turned out to be a fluke, she could reverse the modifications. Laura slept the best she had all week. On Saturday, 2 bombshells were dropped within an hour of each other. The first was brought by Pete, who entered to her chamber against her wishes, concerned that his wife was not responding. He contacted his brother and invited him over to his house. The brother said he had done so. Pete's wife asked where his brother wanted the divorce papers delivered. She called him at work and discovered that he was not on a business trip, but was on yearly leave. That explains how Dave knew about it. Peter immediately flew home to deal with the fallout. Laura quickly contacted her lawyer and had him sign off on all of the adjustments. I escorted Pete to the airport and settled into his vacant room. The second bomb was closer to home and far more damaging. She began examining the 2 younger children's Facebook pages. Nothing had materialized since she had left, no indication of what they had been up to, and no responses to pleas to contact her or recognize her existence. There was a new message on Larry's account. It was notifying to everyone that his mother and father were getting divorced. No. Laura screamed in an empty room, away from her family. What the hell was David doing? Divorce was followed by discussions, arguments, and explanations. Yes, sometimes it was followed by a goodbye, and the children. So she was the family's primary breadwinner and worked hard. It was inevitable. Dave dropped out of high school but kept her in college. Of course, this meant Dave was the main influence in their children's lives, but this shit had gone too far. She prayed to any god who might hear her that she had read the signs correctly and stopped her and Pete's plans before they became reality. If that hadn't happened, Dave would have an irrefutable private investigator's report stating that nothing happened, and now that Peter is gone, nothing will. She began to think rationally when no one was speaking to her. She used her considerable intellect to try to objectively see what Dave was seeing. She made some educated guesses. Someone had found out about her trip to Bali. That someone couldn't be Dave. The only evidence of the plan was on their home computer. And Dave was computer illiterate. This someone, probably Peter's wife, had told Dave perhaps as early as the morning of the flight. All he could know was that she had lied about the destination and was traveling with Peter. Unless the letter, if Sarah had ignored her instruction not to read the letter, if Sarah had shared its contents with her father. Laura quickly pulled out the letter and read it with her eyes fully open. It took 3 attempts, each accompanied by a rapid heartbeat. Point 1 simple statement of facts. Not an issue. Point to preparation. To start twisting the truth, but otherwise facts. Point 3 part truth, part complete lie. And now he could know it. He was a wonderful lover, but she was tired of being in his arms. It was obvious to her. And if he'd seen the letter, it was obvious to him. His private investigator's report would show that having a friend here was inappropriate, and having a male friend her husband knew nothing about was inappropriate in the cold light of rationality. She realized that if he had sent her this letter with an outright lie, everything else would immediately come under suspicion. Consequently, her assurances of fidelity would be useless if she went back to the beginning. Her saying that he was a wonderful lover would also be under suspicion. Suddenly, she realized what his main problem was. Peter was right. She had called into question Dave's entire belief that he was satisfying her. His ego would be badly wounded, but she hadn't betrayed him. The private investigator's report should confirm that, at least as far as this trip was concerned. Naturally, he could assume she'd started fornicating even before this trip. But Laura already had a plan in place to counter such an opinion. When had the private detectives started the surveillance? If the moment they first checked into this hotel, they should have already known that the private room idea was a thing, thought Laura. Too many unknowns. The 4th paragraph, which had seemed so thoughtful and loving when she'd written it, was now, if he assumed it was all a lie, just empty garbage. So was the whole letter. If considered in hindsight, it had turned out to be a complete lie. Laura really hoped he hadn't seen it. Conclusion: if he hadn't seen the letter, she had some fancy work to do. If he had, she suspected no amount of subterfuge would do any good. The irony of the situation almost brought a smile to her face. Her only savior at the moment was the private investigator's report proving that nothing had happened in Bali. Laura hoped the private investigator was good, but took comfort in the fact that he was so good that she hadn't noticed him even knowing of his presence. Laura metaphorically kicked herself. Why had she done that? It had taken a whole night of thinking under the influence of alcohol. Laura had come to the conclusion that she was the classic wife who had everything but saw a future that was different from the past and resented it. A successful wife and high-flying businesswoman who had spent her entire career lying, hiding every possible option, and yes, cheating. A woman approaching menopause who had an itch that needed scratching and then relying on her cleverness and her husband's naivety. Scratch it without consequence. The new irony didn't make her smile. Laura realized that she could soon be a successful businesswoman and a divorced woman who still hadn't scratched that damned itch the next morning. Since there was no indication that she would get answers to her questions here, Laura decided to head home as soon as possible. First, she decided to use her negotiation skills to delay her protagonist's irreversible steps. She wrote a letter to David through Sarah. Laura made the letter vague because she didn't know if Sarah had shown the letter to her father or if she had even read it. Her plan was to try to get out of the divorce situation, but to count on the fact that she would be on the winning side if the worst happened, since she was the kind of person who had foreseen everything. She found counselors in her town and made an appointment online with the one she chose. Then she dressed for the day tours. She had booked 4 days ago. She would still have time to call the airline. Chapter 5. Sarah walks into her father's house and overhears the end of a conversation between her father and his neighbor. So besides telling this Peter's wife about your suspicions, what else did you do, Dave? Nothing. Hey, Sarah, you know John Smith from next door, don't you? He's a lawyer, too. He's kindly agreed to give me some advice. Stop it, Dave. After all the landscaping advice and help you've given me over the years, not to mention all the tools you've lent me, it's the least I can do. Hi, Sarah. Hi, John. Are you here to help Daddy with his divorce? Well, who's talking about divorce? All we know for sure is that your mom lied to us and is spending 2 weeks in Bali with someone. I, for one, will wait to see what she has to say before I decide to divorce her. Please forgive my absent-minded father, John. He can be very naive at times. Yesterday, Mom's attorney called me in to sign a trust agreement that effectively takes away Dad's control of some of the family assets. Then we check all the bank and investment accounts and find that most of it has disappeared somewhere. She's doing her best to take you out, Dad. Admit it. And this one finally reveals her true colors. Sarah held out 2 pages of the printed letter to her father. He read it, then handed it to John. Dear Sarah, would you please print out the enclosed letter and give it to your father again? I rely on your discretion not to read it. It concerns personal matters between him and me. Dear David, I assume you have already realized that I lied to you about the purpose and location of my trip this week. When I return, we will talk about it. And I hope you will listen to my apology for the huge mistake I made with the same patience you have always shown. Just know 2 things, and please don't do anything about it until we talk. 1, I love you, and only you always have and always will. 2, since we became exclusive, all these years I have been faithful to you. Not once have I ever had anything with anyone but you. I can see that my actions of late have given you ample reason to doubt that. And I am willing to do whatever is necessary to convince you of that basic fact. I suggest you give me a lie detector test when I return, hopefully in the next day or so. I am quite willing to stop and take it on the way home from the airport if you can arrange it that way. You will provide questions and ask whatever you want. After this elephant is removed from the room, I can apologize for any disrespect you feel I have shown you. Please, please, please don't do anything rash. We both know what divorce will lead to. You'll lose the house you put your heart into and half the money we plan to spend on your early retirement. Think about the kids divorce polarizes families. And if you ask around, the mother always gets custody. Having Sarah and Danielle on my side is a given. It would be tragic if divorce drove a wedge between them and Larry. I know you love the kids, and we both realize that not being able to see them whenever you want would destroy you. So please don't do anything until you've given me a chance to explain. See you soon. Laura, your loving wife. John finished reading the letter. Wow. It weren't for what we know she's been doing behind the scenes. This would be really compelling emotional material. What do you mean, John? Well, Dave, you have to realize that I see all kinds of tricks in my work. This one is pretty common. Your wife has decided she wants out of the marriage. She looks for a replacement, finds one, and decides to try her out on a 2-week vacation. I think it's called an affair away. Normally, if she decided he was the one, she'd come back and quietly move all the assets out of your reach and then file for divorce. The really smart people poison the relationship between innocent parents and their children first. Like Laura started doing with Sarah, writing a letter portraying you as a wimp that Sarah was allowed to find is one of the most subtle things I've ever seen. The best way to win in a divorce is to deal your partner a complete blow, limit their access to good advice, that is, leave you penniless, and then make your children choose who to go with. In this case, the choice would be between a mother's comfort in the family home and a broke father living in the slums. Surely there must be another explanation. I can prove it. Contact 3 of the best divorce attorneys in town. The one or ones who refuse to take your case are already representing her. I bet she gave all 3 of them a retainer to keep you off the case. If you go broke and get a better lawyer, this bluff has a better chance of working. What bluff? This whole letter is a bluff, Dave. Her lawyer must have already told her that a mother getting custody of children as old as yours is no longer what it used to be. Especially since you have a good chance of being considered the primary caregiver. Dave, the purpose of this letter is simple. She wants you to stop doing anything while she finalizes preparations for the ambush. Her problem is that you found out about her plan before it was fully worked out. When her plan is finalized, she will want the divorce finalized as soon as possible, certainly before Larry turns 14 and could decide which house he wants to live in. You can expect her to insist that you seek counseling in this country. The courts will only grant a divorce if you have lived apart for 12 months, or if a counselor says the marriage is irretrievable. Expect her to pick a counselor and intimidate you. Threats at the end are common for women to instigate divorce these days. Dave withdrew, asking John who the best divorce attorney in the area was. Dave called, gave his name, and asked for an appointment. He was told they couldn't take his case. Dave didn't realize that the best divorce attorney in town had a lot of cases, and he told his secretary not to take any new ones yet. Dave went back to the break room. "Okay, John, I believe you. What do I do now?" "First, you authorize me to lock up any finances. Laura doesn't already have. Then you will restrict her ability to spend any other shared finances. How do I do that?" "Well, start by canceling all credit cards in the joint name." "Okay, but I still feel a little uncomfortable about that. I mean, she's so convincing that she still loves me, but it doesn't really, with the threats in the second half of the letter." "Dad, are you sure Mom lied to you?" Yes. Sarah, do you lie to the people you love?" "Daddy? No, I don't." "What did you always tell us about the 3 pillars of a successful partnership, Dad? Love, trust, and respect, didn't you? How many of those do you have left?" "1, now that you mention it. And how many of them is Mom showing you right now?" "None. Today." Chapter 6. When Laura went to pay the fine for changing her flight date, her 2 credit cards were declined. She rushed to an ATM she'd used before, denied. She went into emergency planning mode. Hotel and meals had been paid for in advance so she wouldn't starve to death or be thrown out on the street. She had a few hundred in traveler's checks just in case, but it wouldn't be enough since there were no friends at home to borrow money from. The only ones left were her parents. Asking them to wire her money would lead to questions she didn't want to answer at the moment. She quickly sent an email to her lawyer asking what was going on with the bank accounts, and then plunged into a boring, no-spending week before her scheduled departure. She wondered how her simple, fail-safe plan to fix the itch could have led to Dave facing ruin so quickly. She knew he would never forgive her infidelity, and had knowingly taken the risk knowing the chances of being caught were astronomical. What could have motivated him to take such drastic action? He suspected that she'd had a fling with another man and already knew that he'd left, and nothing had happened. He had no way of knowing about her financial maneuvers. He didn't even know who their financial attorney was. He had always trusted her to take care of such things, while she was quietly banging her head against the desk in her room. 2 emails arrived that didn't make her feel any better. The first was from Pete's wife, thanking her sarcastically for ruining her marriage and jeopardizing her children's secure future. It might have hurt her badly if the second hadn't come while she was processing the first. At first, it seemed to be one of her own letters to Peter from 2 weeks ago, looking forward to her trip. His and her addresses were listed in the address line, so the letter was forwarded to herself. Attached to the letter was a simple question. "Why did you lie to us, Mom?" The letter was signed, Danielle. Her husband may have been computer illiterate, but her children were not. She realized for the first time that Dave wasn't the only victim of her deception or the only participant in her punishment. She also realized that the letter didn't answer that simple question. It also presented Sarah's unresponsiveness in a different light. Laura cried with loss and disappointment. She then sent a letter to Danielle that basically said she would explain the misunderstanding when she got home. Her daughter must have been expecting it because the reply came immediately. "It's strange that you chose to spend our school vacation with another man instead of with Daddy and us." Laura cried again. It had been an extremely stressful and boring week. On a tight budget, there was nothing to do but lie on the beach. She gathered up her towel. After an hour, she left the beach and returned to the hotel. She realized that coming home with a great tan was tantamount to once again proving everyone a liar. Gripped by frustration, she sent a long letter home via Sarah. Without going into detail, it spoke of errors in judgment on her part of being taken for granted as a wife, mother, and primary breadwinner. It even talked about her sense of self-worth and "That's my excuse" style. It mentioned twice that she had never slept with anyone but Dave during the marriage. The letter again urged her not to do anything rash until she had a chance to talk. There was nothing like an apology in the letter. It was not the style of a strong businesswoman who knew she was in an advantageous position. She hit the send button and got comfortable enough to wait. Chapter 7. Okay, kids. It's time to have a serious discussion about what we're going to do when your mom gets home. I'm a little surprised that she decided to stay there, and unless we find out anything different, we'll have to assume she'll be back on Friday as planned. How are we going to play it? Remember? All we know is that she planned to leave with a guy from her job. We don't know anything about whether this is the first time she's lied to us. You first, Sarah. Well, all I had to do was read her last letter. Dad. It shows that she's just an entitled bitch who treats us like a minor inconvenience to be sidestepped. The fact that she cheated us the first time is, in my opinion, irrelevant. She had a choice. Take her annual vacation and spend it with her family, or use it to disappear with someone else. She already spends a little time with Danielle and Larry given her long work hours and business trips. I think her behavior before and after she was found out is just disrespectful to all of us and dishonest without a major change in her behavior. I'm done with her. Good, Sarah. Harsh, but fair. What about you, Danielle? I think she just doesn't get it. Daddy, I agree, dear. When we hear from Larry, I'll explain what I'm thinking of doing, Larry. I don't care, Daddy. Just as long as I stay with you, I'll do everything in my power to make that happen, son. Tell us about your idea, Dad. I think for some reason your mother went off the rails for a while. I do not know, but the promotion last year seems to have triggered a change. Kids, I hope you'll support me. I think if she admits what she's done and is truly remorseful, we should give her another chance. What do you say? Sarah looked at her younger siblings and felt agreement. Little kids just needed stability until they reached that reactionary age when they would discard everything their parents believed in and try to change the world. That's right, Daddy. We'll try. But you saw her last letter? I've reread it 16 times and I see no remorse. Strangely enough, I believed her when she wrote that she had never been unfaithful to you. I agree, Sarah. That's why I've planned a little shock for her. Once she experiences it, she will realize that we believe she has already committed a crime against the family. I don't think she realizes how offended we are, which is why she is concentrating on the physical impact. After we get her to understand our feelings, the million-dollar question is what she will do about it. If she breaks down and apologizes to all of us, we'll talk about it. If she doesn't, then we'll see. That's my idea. Chapter 8. The return letter took Laura by surprise. It came from Sarah, but it was addressed to Dave and all 3 children. It described the timetable for her return. After reading it, a sense of foreboding gripped her as if she had failed in the tasks set before her. She was expected to return late Friday night. The letter said she had an appointment with a polygraph examiner and indicated that all 4 rebels were taking the questions after the test. She was put up in a motel for 2 nights so she could mull over her answer anytime after noon on Saturday. She could request a meeting to discuss the family's future. Laura resented being ordered around, but for now, she decided to play along with their little game. One thing was certain. As soon as she ate her humble pie, she would be in for a serious beating. People need to know who's boss around here. Relieved, she relaxed a little. She was glad her offer of a lie detector had been accepted. It was the surest way to convince Dave that she had kept her vow. She knew that if she could convince Dave, the rest would fall into place. What questions would he ask? He knew her behavior in Bali. That was A. The main question he would ask would be, had she done anything with Pete before Bali? If he asked the direct question, did you have sex with Peter or anyone else other than your husband? She would be at home. She feared he might ask more insidious questions, such as, have you always behaved in a manner befitting a wife? And then she would be on shakier ground. She had nothing with Peter in the strict Bill Clinton-like sense of the word. Then there was Michael before Pete. They hadn't had sex either, but only because Mike had chickened out at the last minute. Laura realized it was a mistake to anticipate the questions too much. She knew that polygraphs relied on indicators such as heart rate and sweating. By taking the questions at face value, she risked raising her stress level and causing a false positive reaction. However, she practiced answering her simple-minded husband's implied questions anyway, generally relaxed. She went to the airport at the appointed time. She deliberately didn't tell anyone what time her flight was arriving with the excuse that everyone would be busy at work or school. She insisted on a cab. There was no way her family would be in the domestic terminal when she arrived at the international terminal right, coming out of customs. She couldn't help but compare how she'd arrived with how she'd imagined it. Instead of purring like a contented kitten, she arrived with a begging bowl in her hands. After a cab ride, she sat in the polygraph reception area for an hour until one of the technicians ushered her into the room. He outlined the basic procedure of pre-test questions to calibrate the equipment to her specific physiology. Then the technician pulled out a folder and frowned. Right. This is the one. Laura blushed slightly, knowing the nature of the questions. She realized that the operator would soon guess her recent history. Mrs. Brown, my questions are in a rather unusual format. Instead of the usual list of questions, they are presented in flowchart form. Yes, I've seen that a couple of times before. There's a first question, and then, depending on the answer to that question, a choice of what to ask next. It slows things down a bit, but it doesn't affect the validity of the tests, I assure you. Are you ready to work? Ready as always. The operator moved on to the 8 calibration questions, then paused to open, file again, and read. Question 9. 2 weeks ago, you went to Bali with the intention of doing this with Mr. Peter Auer? Yes. The operator looked at the polygraph reading and made a notation. Then he looked at the file. Laura was not surprised by the question. She braced herself for the next one. Would it be a question about whether she had actually done it with Pete in Bali? Or a question about whether she had done it with Pete before going to Bali? She hoped, like hell, that the question be asked in a form that she could plausibly deny to the simple question, "Did you have sex with Peter Auers?" She could answer no and walk on by. Please keep it simple. The technician closed the file and began taking the paper out of the machine. Thank you, Mrs. Brown. I have an email address to send the report to. You are free to go. To say Laura was stunned is a vast understatement. What the hell does that mean? What? Just one question, yes, an unusual one. I've only seen this once before, and I know that guy was trying to say something. I think whoever wrote those questions was too. To your husband. Laura nodded automatically. What was he trying to say? Because I don't understand. I assume your husband wants to say that he doesn't care at all if you had an affair in Bali. He just wanted to confirm that you were going to do it. He's saying loud and clear that your intention to have sex with this guy from Peter is enough for him. Good luck, Mrs. Brown. There are business cards for a couple of good divorce attorneys on the receptionist's desk. Laura left the room in a daze. She had based her entire defense, her entire learning process on convincing her husband that she hadn't slept with anyone else lacking professional merit. She had no idea how offended he was by her dishonesty and simple intent. Frustrated and angry, Laura made her final mistake, ignoring the opportunity to go somewhere else to allow time to make a rational decision. She into a cab and drove home. In her opinion, it was now a true battle of wills. The competitive instinct kicked in. Dave had fired the first shell, and now it was her turn to return fire. The cab dropped her off at the entrance to her neighborhood from the car on the opposite side of the street. Dave, Daniel, and Larry looked sadly at each other as they watched the enraged woman head toward the former family home. They were grateful that they had made all the provisions last night. The last thing Dave wanted was to be abused in front of the kids. It would definitely be bad for their health. They made it to the room they had booked for Laura, checking to make sure their phones were turned off. Chapter 9. There was no word from Laura until Monday. The hope that she had used this time to think rationally was faint, but present nonetheless. That last hope faded when late Monday night, Dave received an email from Sarah. It censured him for his low tactics of sticking the kids on her. It spoke of an emergency family court hearing her attorney was organizing to decide temporary custody of Danielle and Larry, playing on John's predictions. It also informed her that she had scheduled an appointment for them. See a psychologist the next day. A family meeting was required on Wednesday night. Laura pondered over the weekend and, as usual, devised a plan that she felt covered all the bases. First, it was necessary to try to save the marriage that Dave seemed to have written off. That meant attending a counselor, a female one, of course. to enhance the odds of her conveying her train of thinking to her husband. Second, family sessions to explain her actions to the children. Third, of course, a trial to make sure she would be on the winning side if the worst happened. Laura was already in the counselor's room when Dave arrived just on schedule on Tuesday. He quickly took a liking to the woman in her mid-40s, dressed as a representative of the 60s. Chairs were positioned facing the counselor, but more than an arm's length apart. After introductions during which Laura was Laura and Dave was Mr. Brown, the aging hippie, let Laura speak first. Laura discussed the history of their marriage and then set out the facts as she viewed them. She had been a good wife and mother until for some reason she went off the rails, lied to her family, and had a date with another man. There was no sex as her husband's observation of her demonstrated, but the intent was there. While departing, she was surprised to hear that her credit cards had been canceled. She regretted what she had done, and her most earnest intention was to simply put the experience behind her and move on with her marriage to David. The counselor stared at Dave. First, I would want to say that I am speaking on behalf of myself and our children. My children's primary issue is that their mother lied to them, used 2 weeks of her annual vacation, which is 6 months to go off on her own, and left her phone number so that she could not be contacted in case of an emergency. In all honesty, I did not commission any monitoring of Laura and Barley. This startled Laura since that was the first thing she would have done. She couldn't believe it was true. In fact, I didn't even want to think she was messing around on the side until our youngest hacked into Laura's email account and found indications of the arrangements she and her boyfriend had left behind. Also, for the record, I was advised to delete my credit cards after my oldest daughter found that my wife was in the midst of locking up all the family finances in a way that left me impotent. Once again, Laura was stunned. She had not even aware that her measures had been detected, nor had she considered about how such actions would be viewed. The fact that both of her daughters were actively working against her did not help her mood either. As for what my wife wants out of this process, please excuse my inability to trust anything she says now. Before Laura could reply, the anger of his comments revealed how angry her husband was by her conduct. The counselor turned to Dave. What do you want to achieve as a result of these sessions? I'm hoping to figure out why my wife thinks it's acceptable to lie to her family and go off to have fun with another man. At this point, David and Laura's marriage could possibly be saved. Everything shifted in a second. The counselor, who mumbled nearly under her breath, was responsible for the shift, not the husband or wife. We have a dinosaur. Dave, who believed Laura had orchestrated the whole situation to hurry the divorce and had purposefully chosen the counselor to reduce the possibilities of reconciliation, jumped out of his seat. He'd heard about such counselors and believed it was completely improper. He raced out of the room. Laura, who had a small chance of avoiding tragedy if she had chased Dave down and apologized to him, vented her wrath on the counselor. Dave had already left by the time she finished the thrashing. Laura accepted the counselor's apology and agreed to an individual appointment with her the following week. She later apologized to David for her inappropriate actions and held an individual session with him. This would be the third mandatory session, with a decision on whether to continue or drop out. Chapter 10. Laura's family gathering the following day did not go well. She simply didn't comprehend. When someone speaks a falsehood, trust becomes a footnote in history, right above a hurled, woolly mammoth. She'd asked them all over for dinner before the meeting, but Sarah reminded her that she couldn't cook worth a damn and said they'd all there at 7:30 p.m. Laura attempted to hug everyone as they went in, but they all treated her coldly. Laura made the mistake of seating last, and when she was ready, she found herself alone in front of 4 stairs from the couch. She attempted to persuade her best friend, Sarah, to move over to her, but to no avail. Frustrated yet again, she began her planned speech. It included a few apologies and a lot of "I didn't really do anything" and excuses. She felt disrespected as a woman and as the primary income for the family. Her husband's attention had become a given, and she began to crave the attention that single women took for granted. When a younger man began to notice her, she felt ridiculously attractive. She gave in to his attractions during the chat. Laura attempted to focus on Daniel and Larry. Sarah found it difficult to meet Dave's stare, and she was jotting notes in her notebook behind her elevated knees, slightly irritated. Finally, The quiet of those she had come to refer to as the opposing bench silenced her too. Sarah spoke up. "Damn, Mom, you've failed me yet again? What? Why? I can only give you an 85% on the cliché test. If you had mentioned it, it would have been fine if no one knew. I could have given you my all." Nobody knew whether Laura reddened in rage or because she realized she had also meant to say that, but it had slipped her mind. Whatever the cause, she knew she wouldn't get any sympathy from her children, as long as Dave maintained control over their hearts and thoughts. "David is in the kitchen. Now please." Laura jumped on him as soon as they were alone behind closed doors. She tried him through tight teeth. "Does it have to be like this, David? I'm going to break you till you crawl back and beg my pardon." Dave gazed at her with sadness, realizing that she remained a captive to her own character. "No, it does not have to be like that. If you simply do what you believe is the right thing to do, the outcome is not guaranteed. If you drop that idiotic woman you've selected as your impartial counselor and come to us, I will see you in court. David." Chapter 11. Dave moved into his 3-bedroom leased property on Thursday. The case was definitely not going to conclude soon. He had also been advised that Danielle and Larry's preliminary custody hearing was planned for the following Tuesday. When he learned the name of the family court judge assigned to him, he called John. John explained that he had gotten lucky and had chosen the same judge who had never granted custody to his father. Dave declined John's offer to defend him, but requested a weekend meeting to learn about the procedures and what he could and couldn't say. He planned to use the method properly once before returning to his own strategies. He was doing what was necessary to ensure his children's mental well-being. So we spent the weekend setting up the leased house. Dave sat the kids down at the table and told them honestly about his short-term and long-term intentions. They perked up and participated in the planning. They scoured the internet for whatever they needed. Laura's attorney was surprised to learn on Tuesday that Dave planned to represent himself. He anticipated Laura's unenviable position when questioned by her own husband. The court was late that day, so only administrative matters could be handled until the end of the session, after which everyone was required to appear the next day. Overnight, the news reached numerous local reporters, and the next day's Newsweek began with Laura's attorney discussing property ownership, relative earning power, and other information. Dave then started asking questions. Laura was visibly apprehensive, and the media noticed. He started hesitantly. "Did I construct the family house with my own hands?" "Yes, you did, but I was busy working and earning the majority of my money." "Did you go back to work within 2 months?" "After all, the children have been born." "Yes." "Who normally prepared our children's breakfasts, school lunches, and dinner?" "You?" "I worked long hours. Would you call me the primary caregiver, probably?" "You recently lied to me and your children and went to Bali for 2 weeks with the sole aim of doing it with another man." "Objection, Your Honor. Someone has to inform Mr. Brown that infidelity is no longer an issue in child custody issues in this nation." "I apologize, Your Honor. I don't care about infidelity. I simply want to highlight the character of my wife, who considers herself an excellent mother." "Objection, overruled. So I traveled to Bali because I needed a holiday. And it just so happened that I went with a male colleague from work." "Yes, when you went for Bali after lying to your family, did you leave the following note for your spouse to discover?" Dave read the entire letter. Out of the corner of his eye, he spotted both reporters frantically jotting something. Laura did not have to answer the question. Her enraged glare did the trick for her. It was embarrassing. "Is it true that you have never apologized to your husband or family for your deception and clearly immoral motives since returning from your disastrous trip?" Again, the stern response was silence. "Your Honor appears to have made an easy decision. I have always been the primary caretaker of my minor children. They should be granted to me, together with the house I built and in which they have spent the majority of their lives. I have never cheated on my wife or told her any blatantly damaging lies about the children, and I demand that she retracts this. She has demonstrated via her behaviors that she cannot influence my children." Dave sat back in his seat, his back to Laura. Her furious gaze attempted to burn holes in the back of his head. The judge was fully awake and issued her decision instantly. The idea was that numerous studies had proved that in the event of a divorce, it was always preferable for the children to reside with their mother. Laura would receive temporary custody and live in the family home as a result of her decision. Laura smiled smugly. Dave stayed neutral. This was exactly what he expected after speaking with John. He stood up. "Your Honor, please allow me to address the court. I'd like to draw attention to your own choices in Harper v. Harper, Smith v. Smith, Fulton v. Fulton, and others. Too many to mention where you were granted custody, the primary guardian." I received no response from the judge. Dave went on to list 3 scientific publications that refuted the idea that children are always better off with their mothers. "What's the point, Mr. Brown?" "I am only curious, Your Honor. Can a man with a penis prevail in your courtroom?" The judge fixed his gaze on Dave. He gazed back, perplexed. Then she proclaimed the case closed and set up the next one. The reporters were hurriedly writing. Dave stepped up and handed them copies of Laura's letter. Then he went away without looking back. Laura's lawyer approached and praised her. She did not feel like celebrating. Dave's speech on how she felt no guilt for her actions had struck a nerve. Unfortunately, her instinct to win any fight did not allow her to back down once the game was over. Dave wrote off his marriage to Laura's smug smile, counting all the people who had offended his sense of justice and needed to be re-educated. There were 3 of them, and their plans were already in place. He had already consulted Sarah for a second view and implemented the improvements she recommended. In fact, one of her recommendations was significantly better than what he had in mind. He went home, contacted a buddy in the federal government, and sent an email to the president of the federal court stating his charges of prejudice against one judge. He then waited for Danielle and Larry to get back from school. They easily accepted his request to spend at least the next 2 nights with their mother. He then handed them the equipment for the second step of his plan, despite the fact that media pieces published the next day painted Laura and the judge in a negative light. Dave clipped them out and emailed them to a friend who knows a friend of a friend. Chapter 12. Laura, let's mix things up on Wednesday afternoon. Arrived home on time. Daniel and Larry were there, but it was evident that they were protesting. When they agreed to answer her inquiries, they used as few words as possible. She had to ask them to prepare the school lunches for the following day. It had been so long since she had done it that she had forgotten about the lack of suitable items in the cupboards. She ended up handing them money for the canteen. She returned home at 4 p.m. change for her at 5 p.m. There was a solo counseling session during the session. She outlined her criteria for taking Dave back. This occupied half of the session. The counselor spent the rest of the time discussing their marriage's history. Laura admitted having 2 questionable relationships before Peter, one with a coworker and the other with a neighbor. She underlined that there was no actual sexual intercourse among the 3 companions. She failed to emphasize that in the first 2 occasions it was not her choice. She showed real surprise as to why Dave was so outraged by her conduct. Since nothing had transpired, the counselor agreed to check with her husband about the terms, but warned that reconciliation was improbable, given Dave's objections, which appeared to be based on dishonesty and intentions rather than acts. The discussion with Dave the next day was brief, abrupt, and a touch terrifying. When asked what he wanted from the session, Dave just gave her 2 options. He either wanted a referral to another counselor who would not openly condone female infidelity, or he wanted her to sign a document declaring the marriage irretrievable. She was concerned that her comments from the first session would harm her professional prospects. The counselor promptly notified the relevant authorities that the marriage had been dissolved. She was aware that one more report about her to a professional group could be her end. When Dave returned home, Danielle and Larry had already arrived and appeared to be very comfortable. A police officer knocked on the door and informed him that he was in violation of a family court order. He clarified that it wasn't him, but his children. The only way to eject them was with force, which would be deemed assault. The policeman requested the youngsters to accompany him, but they refused. He left to receive instructions. Laura burst into the home as soon as Michael returned. "David, I've already told you that it doesn't have to be this way. Just tell Danielle and Larry to join me. Give me the house and I will be generous in terms of visiting and property division. Laura, please, my property. I will not force my children into a circumstance that they do not desire, and it will undermine their sense of right and wrong. David, how long have we known each other? You recognize me. I am not a bad guy. That is the problem, Laura. I do not know you. The woman I married would not have done what you did. She would absolutely not have done what you did. And then, with no guilt, she urged our counselor to provide me an ultimatum. Put up with your behavior or lose everything I cherish. And especially after I discovered in counseling yesterday that you had attempted to have relationships with 2 other men prior to Peter. Tell me, Laura, what specifically did I do to deserve what you did to me? So what are you going to do now? Laura blushed when she realized the counselor had flushed her into the river. Guilt prevented her from venting her rage on Dave. The bitch counselor was another story entirely. Laura's ire was now directed at her. She has no right to claim that Dave made no comment on that statement, explicitly or implicitly. Laura stormed away in rage. Dave went and wiped the recording recorder that Daniel had placed in Laura's purse prior to the counseling session and retrieved afterwards. He was certain that righteous justice was coming to visit the counselor, and he was correct. 3 days later, the counselor was notified that her services were no longer necessary. 1 down, 2 to go. On Saturday morning, child services arrived but were disappointed when it became clear that the children would only leave if they were pulled out of the house, screaming and kicking. The senior officer told Larry that they made a mistake by attempting to apply reasoning to a very emotive circumstance. The judges have ruled that it is best for you to live with your mother, so the courts got it wrong. Danielle and I don't want to live with a liar who has damaged our father. That marked the end of it. Laura spent the next week attempting to reestablish her authority over the 3 children. They eventually refused to return her calls and promptly removed her emails and phone messages. She attempted to speak with Dave, but when he learned that the conversation did not contain an apology, he ended it, giving up. He engaged John as his divorce lawyer. He also went to Sarah's employer to validate the instructions she gave him. At the end of the following week, he learned from Sarah that Laura was leaving on another business trip for the entire week. He took the week off and did an excellent job assisting the children, after school and throughout working hours. What exactly the work entailed. Laura discovered out when she got home the next Friday. She turned into the driveway, marveling at the nicely planted yard in front of her, complete with a hanging pool. There was also a brick garage. All that was missing was her stunning, award-winning home. Her collapsible palace was dismantled. In its stead stood a single, severely damaged building. Apparently, it was purchased at one of the insurance write-off auctions after being damaged. I am in a daze as I travel. She opened the door and noticed Dave had made an effort to replace the locks. All of her clothes, some of her furniture, and personal belongings were present. She felt torn between rage and deep sadness. For a while, the sadness prevailed on the floor. A copy of the title Deeds could be found right in front of the door. She read that land and dwellings had an address. She realized she had been duped. She owned the land, and there was a dwelling on it. She contacted her lawyer to confirm that nothing could be done about the house. After some thought, she called her financial advisor to modify the only financial agreement she had entered into that could be changed at this time. It concerned a trust into which a vacant plot of land had been transferred. She was informed that Sarah had already exercised her right by transferring all documents into her name only. Laura's final act before losing her mind was cursing her own arrogance when she assumed all 3 children would side with her. Then she realized that the rest of her family had turned against her, Dave for stealing her house, and the kids for not supporting her. She was on the verge of admitting the enormity of her crimes, but self-pity gave way to anger before the connection could be fully realized. She wrote letters to all 3 children. "Do you really hate me so much?" A lonely response came back. "We don't hate you. You knew I'd do whatever it took to keep our family safe. It's just unfortunate that you've put me in the position of having to protect them from you." Signed, Dave. Laura gathered her personal belongings before checking into the motel. She drove through Sarah's neighborhood to ensure that the modules from her old house were neatly lined up, ready to be installed and plugged in. On Monday at work, she received Dave's divorce petition. He apologized for putting it there, but explained that he had no idea where else she might be. She spent the next hour attempting to read between the lines of the agreement, which at first glance appeared generous. It gave her complete ownership of the jointly acquired property, which, given that the majority of the other assets were frozen, was a significant amount. Several expenses needed to be deducted from the property's value. These included the cost of air travel and a hotel room in Bali. I explained that these were the amounts Dave believed Laura had stolen from the marriage. The cost of the divorce and the cost of uncovering her financial fraud were also deducted, including half of the expected interest on the funds placed in a trust for the next 2 and 5 years, respectively. She asked that the children be placed in the care of whichever parent they chose for the sake of unity. If Danielle or Larry chose the other parent, Larry, as the youngest, would make the decision. Family unity was paramount. Laura called her financial advisor and asked what the chances were of revoking the 2 trusts in the children's names. She was told there were none. He did his job well. She attempted to appoint another counselor through her divorce attorney, but because the first had already consented to the marriage, Dave's consent was required. When she demanded such consent through the attorney, Dave reminded her that he had already suggested another counselor a few weeks before and had been rejected. It was too late for Laura, who appeared to be motivated solely by the prospect of her impending demise. Laura signed the contract knowing it was the best she could get because the family court had undoubtedly granted her custody of Danielle and Larry, and she would receive the assets pledged in the minor children's trusts as their legal guardian. That meant she would lose only the value of the second parcel of land when all the I's and T's were dotted. The divorce went quickly. The lawyer assured her that they would be heard by the same family court judge since they were under her jurisdiction, and she had a reputation for being very biased. The lawyer usually advised his male clients who confronted her to give up and save their money, knowing that her vengeful plan was on track, that she would win and Dave would be left destitute. Laura relaxed. She wondered if Dave's pride would allow her to crawl back in which case she would be magnanimous in setting conditions, or if he would resign himself to buggery. Chapter 13. Having regained her, Laura went to court a month later. She was met by an anxious lawyer. He pointed to a woman in a suit in the front row of the public gallery. "You see that woman? I went to law school with her. I hear she's now working in the office of the Chief Justice of the Federal Court. Something's going on, and I don't like it." He was clearly agitated, and it infected Laura with nervousness. The judge opened the hearing by announcing that this was her last case as she was taking early retirement. She didn't seem to be thrilled about that. Then the lawyers began. Laura objected to Dave's demand that Laura be charged all legal fees. He suggested that Laura pay Dave's costs and vice versa. John disagreed, pointing out that he was acting pro bono for Dave. From that point on, things went downhill. John painted an accurate picture of the couple and their relative merits as guardians. There was little Laura's attorney could do. He seemed to regret trusting the judge's protocol and not preparing much factual evidence. The proceedings lasted all morning and were clearly one-sided. Once again, the judge ruled on the case, often glancing the costumed woman in the audience and speaking as if she had a mouthful of broken glass. She declared that the facts of the case were straightforward, and Dave, as the primary caregiver, should get. She even congratulated him on the generous offer he had made to Laura for the division of property and hoped he could raise the children well on the share he had accepted. There was insincerity in her voice the whole time. Laura was so shocked that she missed the final clang of the judge's gavel. She returned to her lonely one-bedroom apartment and wondered which bus had hit her. She couldn't indulge in self-pity, however. She was facing a property division lawsuit in anticipation, a financial decision. She put her old house up for sale. It was a steep, uncomfortable neighborhood, suitable only for a very specific house, and the price she had agreed to set for it was very low, unless someone replicated her old house. Exactly. Even the landscaping would have to be abandoned. It had been spectacular before, but only because of Dave's ingenious design. This afternoon, with settlement time, she wanted to present the title deeds to the new owners herself and wish them to enjoy the house as much as she had. She was disappointed when the man present announced that he was only the agent for the new owners. They would be here soon if she wanted to wait. When Laura saw David's car leading 4 trucks moving her old house with a crane behind them, she decided to leave at the new place. She looked at the meager check she held in her hand. All she had gotten from the train wreck she had turned her successful life into. Still slightly dazed, she wrote in her reflection journal that a friend had recommended to her to help her cope. She took a red felt tip pen with a felt tip marker and wrote in big, bold letters, "Next time you get an itch, go to a goddamn drugstore. Next time you screw up, damn, apologize. You're twice as smart as you think you are." About 8 weeks after she was supposed to do this, Laura went out to eat some humble pie. She bought a bottle of champagne to congratulate the new homeowners when she arrived. Thank you for taking time to hear today's story. If you loved the story, please like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you have a tale to share regarding your own or someone else's circumstance, please do not hesitate to contact me. Take care.